And it's on. Good. Hello, everybody. Okay, this is wonderful. My name is Chris Reagan. I am chair of Canada's Eco-Fiscal Commission. Welcome to all of the people out there in TV land who are watching this live Google Hangout with a bunch of experts ready to talk about recycling. Let me just say kind of big picture what we're all about here today. The Eco-Fiscal Commission released a report today called Choose Wisely. It is for provinces in this country who are either carbon pricing or who are thinking about carbon pricing. And the report is not actually about the pricing itself. It's about once you've already got a price in place and you start generating revenues, what are you going to do with the revenues? And as the title suggests, we think there's lots of options. We think there's lots of trade-offs. This is an economist's dream of a paper because it is chock full of trade-offs. And we think, therefore, governments are going to have to think very carefully about their objectives and choose wisely from among the options. So that is the big picture. Today's conversation is about revenue recycling of carbon revenues in Alberta. And I've got 4 people here on this panel who are well placed to talk about this. So let me start with David Dodge. David Dodge is currently a senior advisor at Bennett Jones. He is the chair of the National Council of at the C.D. Howe Institute. He's the former almost everything in this country. He's the former the governor of the Bank of Canada. He's the former deputy minister of finance. And if you take the time to ask him, he'll tell you the other things he also has done with the Canadian government. Sara Hastings-Simon is a director of the Clean Energy Program at the Pembina Institute. She was a manager of the clean tech practice at McKinsey & Company, I believe in the Calgary office, and she holds a PhD in physics from the University of Geneva. That's not something easy to get. Jack MIntz is the President's Fellow at the School of Public Policy, University of Calgary, where he used to be the Palmer Chair and the Director, I think from 2008 to last year. He's on the advisory board of the Eco-Fiscal Commission. And he used to be the president and CEO of the C.D. Howe Institute, and he was the chair of the federal government's Technical Committee on Business Taxation. I'm not quite sure how many years ago that was, but it was a while ago. Deborah Yedlin is a columnist at the Calgary Herald on the economics and energy beat. She holds a bachelor's degree in economics from the University of Alberta. She's got an MBA from Queen's University, and she's been writing about these kinds of issues for some time. So, what we are going to do today is we are going to ask very quickly each of these 4 people. We're going to give them, they are going to give us a 2-minute version of how they would like to see Alberta's revenues recycled. And then we will see what kind of overlap we've got. We'll see what kind of disagreement we've got. And then we will pursue that discussion. So let me start with Deborah Yedlin.
Hi, thanks for including me in this interesting platform for discussion, because of course this is a very interesting and important issue in Alberta right now. So my conclusions from the report in terms of what the recommendations are and how I think about this is really the Alberta government's going to have an opportunity to use the money that generated by the carbon tax that's going to come into effect in January of 2017 to invest in R&D that will decrease emissions while at the same time increasing productivity, which will lower costs and also continue to help the energy sector become more competitive. Because right now we could very easily argue that it's not competitive, and there needs to be some sort of government catalyst to encourage that competitiveness. Certainly we go back to Peter Lougheed and his involvement and his commitment to AOSTRA, which really spurred the development of the oil sands. The second thing I would say is that we do need to look at the issue of reducing corporate taxes. Alberta used to have a tax advantage. It's not what it used to be. We have a very important need to diversify the economy. Other jurisdictions have made themselves much more tax competitive to attract new businesses and to help diversify their economies, and I think of Denver as one example, and Colorado, and it's something that the Alberta government has to consider very seriously if we really are committed to increasing the economic diversity of the province. And the third thing I would say is that we do have to consider what needs to be done in terms of helping transition businesses and households to this new structure, whether it's those that are more trade exposed and of course low income families. But I think those options are very well laid out. But my top picks really are to invest in innovation and research and development, to increase productivity, decrease emissions, and make the province more competitive.
Thank you, Deborah. An issue that I hope we come back to at some point in the next hour is on Deborah's first choice about making investments in R&D to reduce emissions and to lower costs. To what extent are governments actually able to do that and to drive those kinds of outcomes? I hope we come back to that issue. How about over to Jack now?
Thank you very much. I'd like to always remind people about what is the point of bringing in policies like carbon pricing, and also when you're doing it through fiscal measures such as either auctioning cap and trade allowances by the government, or in the case of a carbon tax, putting in a tax. And there's really two issues that are involved. One is the objective of improving the environment, and that's what you think of as a first dividend of a carbon tax. And the second is to use the revenue in such a way that you can get a second dividend, which is a good use of the fiscal revenue so that you can improve the economy. And I think we also have to remember that there's been some changes over the past while the economy in Alberta is in a special situation, let's say, compared to another province like Ontario if it were to bring in a carbon tax. And that is Alberta's faced a very difficult time in terms of its economy. And there has been a number of tax increases already in the past year, both in the corporate and the personal side. So my preference is, in terms of using the revenue, is to first of all take advantage of that double dividend. So I would like Deborah, I would argue for incentives for research and development to reduce emissions. I think that's a direct way of reducing carbon. I would also use some of the revenue, not necessarily all of the $3 billion for 2017, to actually reduce corporate taxes, particularly, but maybe some personal tax measures such as offsets for low-income people. And the third use of the revenue may be to help deal with the deficit situation in Alberta. Although that's not revenue neutrality, that is actually increasing taxes on the population. I think the situation in Alberta is that Alberta needs to think like Saudi Arabia, build a big fund for the future, but at the same time try to look at using some of the revenues to restore the Alberta tax advantage, because that's the only way that it can compete in a world where it has a relatively small population and is distant from markets. And if it's going to diversify the economy, it has to have a corporate tax system and a personal tax system that's going to sustain that type of activity.
Good, thank you, Jack. Okay, some overlap there between Jack and Deborah, but Jack is also suggesting that some of the revenues get used to finance a budget deficit that is rumored to exist in Alberta. $6 billion, is that right?
We'll find out for sure next week on the 14th when the budget comes down.
Okay,
I think it was $10 billion.
It's $10 billion.
So $10 billion.
$10 billion.
Yeah.
Okay.
And climbing.
It's at $35 billion.
Thank you. Okay, how about Sara?
Great, thanks for having me here today. Excited to talk with this group. I think there's really three priorities for Alberta in the use of this revenue, and that comes looking at the role that the climate leadership has to play in Alberta becoming a leader in this climate space, and also, as some of the other folks have mentioned, the need to diversify the economy. And so these three priorities are the investments in low carbon technology. And this is actually two parts. This is both a deployment of market-ready technology solutions that are actually going to reduce emissions, so things like renewable energy, energy efficiency. And then on the other hand, it's also a scale-up, innovation and scale-up of new technologies and businesses that both sit under this low carbon technology umbrella. It's transitional support to industry targeted to emissions-intensive trade-exposed industries, some of which should come in the form of support for emissions reduction as well to help accelerate the transition for those industries. And then finally, household transfers to low and middle-income households. And I think these three priorities will ensure that the climate leadership plan really allows Alberta to deliver on this really ambitious goal to be a global leader on climate change. And given the kind of late start that Alberta has, it's going to take a big step forward to get there. It's going to ensure that you get those significant additional emission reductions by funding some of these supporting policies that address what are really well-known market failures and barriers that don't get addressed by a comprehensive carbon price, and we've seen that in a lot of other jurisdictions. They'll enable Alberta to grow the low-carbon economy, and that's where the diversification comes in. You know, diversification is, I think, by definition, into that low-carbon space. And there's really strong evidence that that requires, you know, public targeted support if you look in the US at what technologies have been successful. And then finally, it'll mitigate the potential impacts to competitiveness and help support the transition while also protecting vulnerable Albertans, you know, empowering those individuals to make changes to turn for the low and middle income individuals the carbon price from a cost into a savings potential for that majority of Albertans. So those are the kind of the three key areas.
Great,
that
thank you, Sarah. So it's interesting. Sarah's three areas, you know, look pretty similar to the three things that have been talked about in the development of the Alberta policy. But maybe we can get Sara at some point to talk about relative sizes of those things. You know, the magnitude of the household transfers, for example, or the transitional support to industries. Okay, let's bring it home now with David Dodge for the last 2-minute blast. Let's see what happens.
Well, I think everybody's dreaming in Technicolor. We have a deficit in Alberta going forward under any reasonable circumstances, in fact, optimistic circumstances, that is 6 billion rising to 10, and that hole has got to be plugged. It's going to have to be plugged either by a 25% cut in real expenditures by the time you get into the new decade, or by roughly $10 billion increase in taxes. So the first job of a government is to do what it's supposed to do, to supply fiscal and income security, education, health, justice, public use infrastructure, and so on. And it needs money to do it. And so you want to raise that money in the way that is least negative for the economy. And it so happens that the carbon tax is actually extremely good in that regard. It does two things. A, it raises the money which you need, but very importantly, it does what we would like to do and provide the incentives for people to do the right thing, both consumers and for producers. So if you're asking, I would have three objectives. Raise money, and raise money, with a bit of an offset for the low income, just as we do under the HST. And indeed, looking at your paper, Chris, I think that the amount of offset would be roughly the same as it would be a rising similar amount from the HST. And finally, there's another real issue, and that is the transition issue, or the problem of the adjustment. And unfortunately, the best tool is not in the hands of the provinces. And this is one reason why I've long believed that a federal carbon tax is the right way to go, because the federal government can make the border adjustments that are necessary to support a carbon tax in Canada, where it may not exist in other countries with whom we trade.
Okay, so you're saying, number one, you got to pay the bills, and so you want to use a big chunk of the revenue to actually finance the deficit, or avoid a deficit, really. Number two, you do want to worry about transition. The best tool to do so is the border adjustment, which is best in the hands of the feds. But how about the transition to households, David? You were talking about transition to businesses there when you talk about border adjustments.
Well, transition for households, I mean, any commodity tax, whether it's a GST or whether it's this, has a certain incidence, and you have in your other paper a diagram of the incidence of it. It looks very much like the incidence of GST, and so you just provide a credit. So your calculation is you need somewhere between 8 and 12% to provide the credit, and that's absolutely appropriate.
So you do it like a low-income GST tax credit, that kind of thing?
Absolutely.
Yep. Okay, perfect. All right, thank you all very much. Now, let me just let me just ask if anybody, now David started out by saying that the rest of you were dreaming in Technicolor, or maybe he meant me too, I'm not sure. But has anybody else heard something from anybody that you want to disagree with? Or at least you want to clarify? Jack?
Okay, I'll start. So first of all, in principle, I agree with some of the things that David is saying, that some of the money definitely has to go into the deficit, but how you deal with the deficit, I think, is going to be more than just the carbon tax. It is going to be, I do view that there's going to have to be some changes in spending, and in fact it can be done in certain ways, but I don't want to get into that kind of debate about how to deal with the budget. I think that raises all sorts of issues. The other thing is that...
Jack, if I could just say, Jack, I would love to have another Google Hangout on the issue of reforming Alberta's fiscal structure.
Right, that's what I'm saying. I don't want to get into...
Let's do that on another... Yeah, no, I would love to do that. We should do that.
But the main point is that the reason I'm arguing that some of the money should be used for reducing particularly corporate taxes, which could be about... it doesn't have to be that expensive given the amount of corporate tax raised, but bringing back the rate to 10% I think would be a very valuable thing for Alberta and a long-term growth thing, and I think that's also an offset for businesses in Alberta. The point that David brings about having a minimum carbon tax at the federal level, I'm absolutely right. I have been very concerned about the issue of border adjustments. The provinces cannot put on border adjustments constitutionally, and that's something in which the federal government can only do. And if there was some sort of floor and border adjustment at the floor, I totally agree with David on that should be done. I don't agree, and I said to provide a little bit of subsidies for research. I think that's only because there's a role of the province and of the federal government too, but of the role of government to support research because of the expropriation, because the private sector doesn't get the same. When somebody invests in research, they only get a return to themselves, not to the full benefit of the economy, when other firms can copy the invention. So I do think there is a role for government there, but I do not think that the government to be providing subsidies to low carbon technology adoption. That's going to happen through the carbon pricing and the other regulations that are being adopted, and I do not think that's necessary at all. So I kind of disagree with Sarah on that point.
Good. Okay, so just on that last point, I just want to signal this, hopefully this will come up again, that the idea about supporting basic R&D, yes, Jack says, but maybe not direct supports to specific low-carbon technologies, because you want basically the carbon price to drive that business model, if I'm getting you right. So somebody will probably disagree. Sara had her arm up adjustments, but maybe not, Sara.
No, it was up about an earlier point, but I'd also love to talk about the subsidies question or the support question. So just wanted to echo Jack's agreement around, or agree with Jack's point around the deficit, that obviously that's an issue that needs to be dealt with, but I don't think it's the role of the carbon tax. That's a much broader issue, and I think the carbon tax revenues or the carbon price revenues should be focused around, the goals of the climate leadership plan itself. The question of government's role or roles beyond the carbon tax in driving adoption of low carbon technologies, I think it's not hard to look, again, given that Alberta is kind of starting a little bit behind, there's a lot of other good examples that show that a carbon price alone is not enough, especially at $20 or $30, to drive the kind of adoption, whether it be in the commercial building sector or others, that you really need, and you see that even today, where there's a lot of measures that people should take that under energy efficiency calculations would be economically advantageous to do now, and people just aren't doing. And so you need to, governments have found very successful ways of using smaller amounts of money to incent people to take these actions, and leaving that on the table, I think, just leaves a lot of emissions reductions that aren't being captured. And then the second point around that is that again, over and over again, we find that as you deploy these technologies, it's really the deployment that's getting you down the learning curve and getting you down the price curve. And so, while we can benefit from a lot of the technological development, whether it's in solar panels or wind turbines that have taken place elsewhere, there's a local deployment component that, in Alberta, we just need to do some of this ourselves and get that going to get down the price curve. So I think that those are two examples where direct government support on these would be needed to actually make action happen.
So there is. So I've got two more people that are now on the speakers list. The first is Deborah, and then David. But on Sarah's point about there's an interesting economics debate about whether the carbon price is sufficient to drive the kinds of emissions reductions that we think we need over the long term. And I think, Sara, you're saying that your view is that it isn't, and therefore that's a reason why we need to support some of that emissions reductions with some of the revenue. I mean, if I've got that right.
Yeah, it's the question of how high the price is and also how responsive to the price are all the actors.
Perfect. Okay, so Deborah, and then David, and then Jack in that order. Deborah.
So I guess I'm a little concerned about the focus purely on low carbon technology, because I recognize that low carbon technology is an issue, and it's something that we have to focus on in terms of, I look at it in the broader context in terms of the industry and what drives the Alberta economy and what it needs to become more competitive. And so from my perspective, I look at it really as looking at how to not necessarily recreate, but establish a mechanism that is not unlike what AOSTRA was in the 70s that Peter Lougheed spearheaded, a place that fosters innovation, creativity, development of new technologies and new ideas that are not just that are sort of applied to the energy sector, but also more broadly speaking, and can also be spun off and exported to other parts of the world as a sort of having Alberta become a center of expertise, a center of excellence, and in all things energy that can be exported around the world. And I think we have to think more broadly. And just to the point on the issue of solar and renewable power, that is a huge can of worms, as we're finding out in Alberta already, as companies are turning back their power purchase arrangements. And it's if you talk to solar providers and Alberta and our sun quotient, it's not such an easy thing to do, and I think we have to be very mindful when you're having people losing jobs. The concern is, how are we going to get the economy going, and then we can focus on this renewable power issue.
So Deborah, I don't want to get into semantics, but
no.
If I think part of your argument is that we need to recognize that the oil patch is an important part of Alberta's future and will be for a number of years, but wouldn't investments in lower carbon technology as opposed to just low carbon technology? I mean, if we came up with ways to reduce emissions,
absolutely,
and
if it's all about
oil sands, wouldn't we be happy with that?
Absolutely. If you're looking for ways to decrease emissions and increase productivity, decrease costs, increase competitiveness. That's what we have to do. Perfect. And that, to me, is the first place to start. And I do think government has a role to play, because I do go back to AOSTRA, and I do think that were it not for those initiatives at the government level, we would not have the oil sands industry developed to where it is today.
Okay, let me turn to somebody who used to work for a government near you. David.
Yeah, so I go back to what I said before. This is a carbon tax. Government needs revenues. It's going to have to raise a bunch of taxes. It's going to have to cut a bunch of expenditures, which really will bear very hard on people. And so the first thing to do is to think of this as a revenue source. And revenue sources are revenue. Revenue is fungible. It's not a dedicated tax. It's not like a toll on a road for running on the road. It is a revenue source, and it's a very good one. And it's a lot better, I would argue, than every other lever that the government can reach to get part of what it needs. And so if you want to discuss this as an eco-fiscal commission with emphasis on the fiscal part, Chris,
yep.
Then you really do have to think about the financing of everything altogether. And this is a very good tax. It's a very good tax. Let's argue for this on the basis of it's a good tax. It provides the right incentives. It has good distortions rather than bad distortions. It's a terrific tax. And so let's not muzzy it up by saying somehow we have to find a way to spend the money. We need a lot of money. We're going to have to raise other taxes and cut other things which we desperately want as residents of Alberta.
I love your passion, David. So I mean, I can't disagree with the idea that as a way to raise revenue, a carbon tax strikes me as probably better than other taxes that we generally use, and maybe even other taxes that you can think of. Jack MIntz is rumored to know something about taxes. Jack, do you agree that a carbon tax, if you need to raise revenue, a carbon tax is a better way to raise it than CIT, PIT, or a GST?
No, actually, I don't agree that it necessarily dominates an HST. It depends on really what you're trying to achieve with a carbon tax. The concept of a carbon tax is to price carbon, so let's start at that proposition. And yes, it is a good thing to do. The question is what you do with the revenue. I think gets back to the budgetary question. Yeah. You want to leave that off the table. I agree with you, because I can talk about how I could use a carbon tax to reduce the harmful taxes in the economy and bring in an HST, which I think is a pretty good tax, and easy to do in Alberta that could actually deal with the deficit. So if you want to talk about keeping, it's all a matter of how you want to change the various on the deck in terms of what you want to do. The one argument I think for David is that, well, now you got the carbon tax in place, people are accepting it. I'm not sure in Alberta how much they are, but if they are, then maybe once you get a tax in place, as is an old adage in public finance, an old tax is a good tax. And it's not an old tax yet, but it may be at some point. Let me raise, I think, a more important question, which is related to the concept of pricing carbon. And this is, I think, Sara raises a deep point that I think needs much more discussion and evaluation in this country. There's been a view that many people say, oh, let's price carbon and let's have a single price, such as through a carbon tax or a cap and trade system where you price carbon as well, and then let the private economy kind of work around that to find the best technologies. And it may be that you need a relatively high tax or whatever, but that would be the best approach, is to have a uniform carbon price. But that's not really what's happening. What's happening is that we use a lot of what I would call implicit carbon prices that are embedded in various regulations, whether it's phasing out coal or acquiring energy efficient technologies in buildings, or et cetera. These are all different, and ethanol and subsidies towards solar and wind. These are all different types of carbon prices, and these are all non-uniform carbon prices. Right. And if we are going to say that a carbon tax is not effective, and not going to do the job at $30 or $40, but maybe all these other regulations are actually much better and are going to do the trick, then why are we bringing in a carbon tax? Which may go back to David's point that maybe it all is just a revenue grab.
Well, actually, I'm going to test David on that. But I'll come back to you, Jack, for a second. My sense is in your comments that you're looking at some of these regulations, you're thinking about the implicit carbon tax, you're finding that they're very high. It seems to me that's an argument against those regulations, right? That's an argument against those regulations.
It may be that uniform pricing is actually a better idea than a uniform carbon price. And the reason a non-uniform one is that, let's say you have substitutes, it's more easy to do it. So for example, we've been phasing out coal, and the United States is going in that direction. Why are we doing it? Because natural gas is a neat substitute for it. It's a lot harder in other areas to find substitutes, so you may not want to have as high carbon prices for those other things. To be honest with you, I'm just thinking about this and have been thinking about it for some time, but I don't have an answer yet for these questions. But I think these are questions that need to be answered about, should we have uniform or non-uniform carbon pricing? I don't know the answer to that question.
So, I mean, the standard argument, as you know very well, is that to get cost-effective emissions reductions, you need a common carbon price across various sources. And you are thinking that there's some other constraints behind the scenes that we haven't considered that may actually change that result.
Right. Well, back to the whole issue of what's been called in commodity taxation optimal commodity taxes. And you can make an argument, and there's been a whole literature in this, that you should have different tax rates, where you, let's say, have higher taxes on those things that, don't cause as much economic distortion as other things. There's been another view, and it depends really on the characteristics of the economy, that you should have a uniform sales tax. In fact, that's what we've adopted for the HST in Canada. But I can tell you there's a whole literature that says you should have a non-uniform one. I think the question in carbon pricing is that I have not seen a really good analysis asking the question, do you want a uniform carbon price or do you want a non-uniform carbon price? I think that's a very important and deep question that we should be asking, because if it's the latter, that may be an argument not to have a carbon tax at all, unless you just want to have it for revenues as a revenue source.
Okay, well, let's come back to the revenue issue. So, David, actually, I want to ask a question that's going to put you on the spot a bit, but it's going to put you on the spot in a hypothetical sense. So I want you to imagine that we are in Alberta from a couple of years ago, or just in a hypothetical setting, right, where Alberta doesn't have a large budget deficit. I'm pretty sure you still, in that hypothetical world, would have been in favor of a carbon tax. You can correct me if I'm wrong. But in that hypothetical world, if Alberta had a balanced budget and they put on a carbon tax, what would be your preferred way to recycle the revenues?
Well, Alberta's been so long without a truly balanced budget because we've relied on this windfall, call it, revenue from the resource sector. And so Albertans have had services provided at a level of about 1.25 to 1.5 times the taxes that they've paid over the last, certainly over this century, up until the last couple of years. And so it's a hypothetical question because they've been so far from being there. It's not just a balanced budget, because as Jack said earlier, the right thing to do with the bulk of those royalty revenues or land sales revenues would have been to put them in a fund and only use the interest from the fund.
Which was the intention of the Heritage Trust from the beginning.
Okay.
Absolutely.
Deborah, sorry, say that again.
I just thought that was the intent of the Heritage Savings and Trust Fund, as it was in court when it was started by Peter Lougheed's government. It was to contribute all, the revenue and to live off the what it generated from an investment standpoint, and that strategy was unfortunately abandoned. And today we are in this position that we are in today, and it's shameful because, as David said, we've let those non-renewable resource revenues fund the subsidize the tax rates of Albertans for far too long, and nobody's actually really cast it in those terms. And now we're sitting in a situation where, yes, we have a huge capacity to issue debt, which is one of the reasons people are saying, well, really, do we need to use additional revenues that would be generated by a carbon tax towards funding the deficit, because we do have the capacity to go into the markets and use a pretty good credit rating, not as good as it was in late. Yeah, it's down a notch, but still. And so, that argument's being played out, and certainly some people in Canada say Alberta shouldn't get any help because we do have the ability to borrow, and so we're in a situation that's very difficult right now.
Okay, I failed in my effort to manipulate David into answering my hypothetical question.
It was a good question.
Well, I thought it was a good question, but he just outsmarts me at every turn. So let me try again. David, to what extent are you worried about the competitiveness issue in the emissions-intensive firms and sectors in Alberta? And you don't get to say here that the federal government has to ride to the rescue with border measures, because this is an Alberta problem right now. So what does Alberta do? They can't just sit around and wait for the federal government to put on border measures. So do you want to deal with that transitional issue for those emissions-intensive sectors with some of the revenue?
Well, I think in some sense that this is the nth best solution, but indeed, you are still collecting a chunk of revenues from the oil and gas sector. Right?
Not that much.
And not as much as you used to, Deborah, but
nope.
It's still, it's a measly couple of billion now. But and so you do have an adjustment you can make in that particular tax for that industry, which is really hard hit. But it's not ideal. It's not an ideal way to deal with it. And and I guess that's all I can say. That that would probably be the tool that I would use for adjustment. But it doesn't help the cement industry, which will probably close, and that may not be a bad thing.
Well, it's not so great if you're in the cement industry.
Well, too bad. You know, lots of things are not great when you're going through a tough adjustment, and you try deal with them at the broad level, but we are adjusting, and they're losers in the adjustment process. And when they're losers in the adjustment process, the thing is to get them out of doing the losing activity and help them into doing a winning activity. I mean, that's the standard trade adjustment issue that you have, and this is in that sense is really no different.
Fair enough. Sara.
Yes, I wanted to respond to a couple things. So one is just to clarify that I'm not saying that I think that a carbon price is not effective. A carbon price is very effective. There are just some specific areas, particularly when you talk about consumers who are not good market actors, where you need additional policies to get them to do the things that make sense from a financial perspective. So please don't take my comments to say that I don't believe in the effectiveness of a carbon price. Related to that, I mean, the question of phasing out coal, obviously carbon is not the only externality that we have in the world. And so if you say that phasing out coal is an effectively higher carbon price, I would say that it's it's a mix of the same carbon price and all those other externalities and other emissions and the health impacts and the health costs of those as well. So I don't think that that's a one doesn't follow from the other. And then the question of that we were, I think Deborah had raised a few points back about, is it low carbon technology? Is it lower carbon? I agree that it doesn't have to all be, zero carbon technology. The goal is lower carbon technology, and that's what we should be supporting. I think it's also important to realize, though, that if we think about, what are we going to create for the export and what is Alberta going to export to markets over the years, we have to be realistic about the fact that the whole world is going towards this low carbon future. Tesla sold 200,000 EVs in one day just recently. So the idea that somehow we are going to, we live in this bubble and everybody else out there isn't also moving towards a lower carbon future as well, I think that we just need to keep that in mind when we think about what we're developing for our export markets. So certainly low carbon oil and gas technologies has a role to play in that, but I think relying on only that would be short-sighted. And then I find that I can't let it go by without just commenting on the solar and the PPAs, because I think those are two really have nothing to do with each other, right? The coal PPAs are being given back because power prices are much lower now than they were when those coal PPAs were purchased, which has nothing to do with whether solar or wind is being phased in. And Alberta actually has really an excellent solar resource, obviously an excellent wind resource as well when you see all of the wind that's out there as well. And so that combined with just the massive drops in cost of that power, as we look to a future electricity grid in Alberta where we're going to phase out coal because of all the problems that are happening, and then the choices between having a pure natural gas grid, there's clear price advantages for the consumer to have a mix of natural gas and renewables. So I think it's just important to detangle that kind of coal picture from the carbon tax, from the PPAs, from the natural gas versus renewables.
Okay, let me pose a question. And it actually relates, I'm going to start moving to questions that have come in from online and from other people out there in TV land. But one of the questions is about protecting low-income households. So a couple of you at least have talked about the need to provide some transitional assistance to low-income households, or maybe you said all households, I'm not quite sure. But what's the best way to do this? Is this, and we talk about this in our report, but what are your views about, should we be giving lump sum checks to families or to low-income families, or should we be having personal income tax cuts, or is it a GST-type low-income tax credit, like David has mentioned? Does anybody have a clear preference on one of these? I'll maybe start with you, Jack.
Yeah, I'll just very quickly, Phil Bizel and I, when we did our paper on early HST, we actually modeled low-income tax credit. It's actually not hard to do. It's easy to run through the personal income tax. I I can't remember the cost per $1 million of raised under the HST now, but it's certainly less than $1 billion. It's more probably in the $100 million range or something like that. If you wanted to give kind of like a full offset in terms of each point increase in a consumption tax. So that I think is the easiest way, and I think it would be the one, if you were going to provide a full impact, would actually help lower and middle income people the most. Well, mainly low income people, not middle income people. They'll be hit with higher prices for heat and gasoline, etc.
Anybody else on that general point?
Chris, it's Deborah. I agree with Jack. Actually, that was the one. I think that is because we know how that can work. Because it is easy to implement. I think this actually makes the most sense. You don't want to have something that sort of creates a whole new bureaucracy unto itself and is complicated and can be gamed. This is something that's more straightforward and I think would make a lot of sense.
Okay. Can I come back to a point that I think Jack raised at the beginning, the difference between government providing financial assistance to basic R&D, and let's suppose it's low R&D about low or lower carbon technologies. The difference between that and supporting more already developed clean tech. Is that a reasonable way to describe that, Jack? And you are in favor of the support of the basic R&D, but not in favor of, basically subsidizing or supporting clean tech. Does anybody want to talk about that? And I want to relate this to, I mean, how much do we believe that government can actually support the R&D in a good way, in a successful way?
Or clean tech.
Jack, do you want to start with that?
Well, I'll just be very quick and let other people respond. Just an R&D, I mean, there are different ways of supporting R&D. Of course, there's a tax credit, there's a grant method, but I think that is kind of well known. We have, we do know, we've had programs like at the federal level, the Industrial Assistance Program, which has gone to smaller businesses to help with new technology developments, and we also know that we can carry out research at universities and institutes that can help develop new technologies, and the business sector itself has been developing it through the Canadian Oil Sands initiative for research that they have done, which has been quite interesting to watch. So there are a number of things that are available, and I think we know how to do that, and for governments to a good partner in it. I'm more favorable to the grant method than the tax credit method these days, because I think you can target the money more appropriately. With regard to clean tech, to me that gets into this is where I totally agree with David. You're getting into picking the winners and the losers, and I think that again, if you do the carbon pricing in some way, people will for the substitutes themselves, and which ones to adopt. And I'm not talking about the ones for research, because there's a special aspect to research in terms of keeping the full spillovers, but just in terms of adoption of new technologies or technologies that are out there and substitutes, I think the private sector will figure that out once they have the appropriate carbon price. And I think the last thing we need is more green subsidies going to to solar, wind, and these things. I think the market could kind of figure out which is going to work.
Thank you, Jack. When you used the expression "picking winners," Sarah's face lit up, and shortly after that, her arm went up. So, Sara, picking winners. We should try.
Yeah. So I mean, I think to me the alternative to the government picking winners and losers is that Canada picks no one, right? And so it is, it's challenging, and you have to do it in the right way. I mean, I do agree on the R&D and the need for grants and things like that. But this idea that somehow you take what comes out of a lab and then all of a sudden you have a product that the market picks up and deploys is just, I think, a fallacy, right? I mean, we see this over and over again in the clean tech space, that the tools that the market has around venture capital and others, they're not well suited for clean tech development. And so there's something in between, you know, we can talk about what kind of subsidies you should have, but there's this big space in between the person sitting in the lab and the full-scale, you know, market-available products that you have. And that's a strong place for the government to play. And it's a place that, you know, the U.S. government was very successful in playing with some of their recovery money around, you know, they did pick winners and losers, and if you actually look at what they did, they picked a lot of winners. They did perfectly fine from an economic standpoint there. But if you don't have government doing those kind of things like creating markets for the technology, saying, you know, there will be this much of our own purchasing power that we put towards this new product to buy, you know, if it's available because it meets our needs and it makes sense. Then you just don't get the technology development happening here. So, you know, sure, it's not an easy thing to do, but I don't think that throwing up our hands and saying that we can't do it, so we do nothing is the answer.
Well, so I think we recognize that government has in the past been able to assist the development of good things, but we also recognize that government has, through those efforts, also wasted a bunch of taxpayers' money. So how do we actually design the machine or design the process so that we maximize the chances that government actually does a good job? I bet you David Dodge has a thought about that.
I have a thought too.
I have one also.
Okay, so I'm putting you on the spot. Sara, why don't you say it?
Okay, I'll say my quick thought is that actually use the private markets, right? So design systems that require private money to come in with government money. So whether it's, you know, government de-risks the first part of the investment, so, you know, use the market to send those signals, but give them the assistance that they need.
So it's Deborah. I just wanted to say I agree that what I was going to say was it can be project-based. Costs are shared with industry because they actually know what they're looking for. And then the technology is available for anybody else to use it. And I think, you know, one thing we don't have a great sort of ecosystem for this kind of innovation and commercialization, who owns the patents. And I think when you look to Israel and what goes on there in terms of the innovation that happens there, how they commercialize and how they approach the innovation model, it's instructive that there are other places that do this much better than we do. But at a minimum, I think I go back to Austria again, it was project-based, grant-based, industry shared the costs, and we actually got somewhere. So the industry has skin in the game, and there's oversight there from that perspective, which also means you have a better shot at getting some success.
Okay, now I'm going to change the subject a little bit, because nobody has yet used the word, to my knowledge, in the last 46 minutes, infrastructure. I'm pretty sure nobody has mentioned it.
Right.
And we've got a question actually from Carol Mayrand online about infrastructure. And the question is how we can reduce emissions by recycling the revenues into infrastructure. He asked specifically about road infrastructure, but Alberta is a province that is growing, and my guess is will continue to grow in the future. It's got an infrastructure issue, as many provinces in Canada do. So how do people feel about using some of these revenues for infrastructure? And maybe I'll start with David, because you, I believe, wrote a report on this for Alberta recently.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. We know a lot about it, and indeed, Chris, you and the Institute Commission have done a very good piece on road pricing. Excellent piece on road pricing. And the thing with infrastructure is that you really do need to price its use right. If you price its use right, you don't need as much of it as you do when you don't price it right. Just like electricity, why do we have time of day pricing in electricity? It's to spread the demand over time. We need the same thing with roads and other infrastructure. But that can be actually financed. That is quite appropriate to finance by borrowing. I don't think you need tax revenues to finance the actual putting in place of the infrastructure, as long as you're going to charge for the use of that infrastructure so that you can maintain it over time and cover, if you will, the interest charge that accrues. So you don't really need the tax revenues for that, but we do need to adopt some of the stuff the Commission has been advocating in terms of pricing use of roads, which of course then means that we can raise the price for public transit and we'll get
You just froze.
people means of transit.
Perfect. Well, as a general rule, David, thank you for that. As a general rule, I am all in favor of all governments across the country adopting eco-fiscal recommendations from that report and from others, including this one. Anybody else have a thought on infrastructure? Because David is saying we don't need revenues for that. We can borrow because if we price it right, we're going to produce an income-generating asset, right, from the users over time. So we can actually do this. Boy, we could have a system of capital budgeting and we could do that.
Well, and then you can actually sell the asset afterwards. It's often hard to finance on 3P, a greenfield piece, but you sure can finance it and at pretty favorable rates after it's built. So you actually get the capital back and you can recycle it. So I think it is totally appropriate to borrow for that infrastructure.
Perfect. Deborah, you've got a hand up?
I'm just, I agree with David, and there's an issue of acceptance in terms of how that all works, and people not so, they say that means you're layering on debt, and principally I agree with David, but I think there is a way to look at it and say potentially a certain percentage of the revenues generated by the carbon tax could be directed into a specific fund, which is separate governance body that says there's a direct line of sight, so people know carbon tax X pays for project Y. When project Y is done, but there's a continuous line of sight in terms of what's being funded, and I think then you actually get the infrastructure that you need built, but you also have the line of sight, so people actually have a sense that it's not going into general revenues, that it is being used, and it is actually causing a broader benefit to society because of the way the dollars are being spent. So I think there needs to be a balance. I do think you can borrow, but I think you can balance it with some of the funding coming from the carbon tax, and maybe the way to do it, as I said, is to have a separate body, a governance-like mechanism. Oklahoma's done it, and it's worked really well. Other cities in the United States have done it, and I'm just wondering, maybe that's something that needs to be considered as well.
Perfect. I'm going to go to Sara next, but just Deborah's idea of a line of sight from the carbon tax to some of the uses of the revenue, I think is very interesting, and it's very common that we policy wonks sit around and we talk about the marginal cost of public funds and optimal taxation and the fungibility of money, etc. Yet the public doesn't necessarily think that way. And in our report, we commissioned some new public opinion surveys to talk about how the public views carbon pricing as a function of how the revenue is used. And the two most popular uses of the revenue, the ones that generated the most support and quite considerable support for carbon pricing, and this was stable across provinces, were infrastructure spending and clean tech investments. Across every province, those were the top two. So, and I think that speaks to exactly Deborah's line of sight, the idea that you can, especially the clean tech investments, I think people see a logical coherence. If you're going to raise revenues from a carbon tax that's about reducing emissions, then put the revenues into something that also reduces emissions. Many economists will tell you why that's not necessarily logical,
Right.
but the public many people in the public kind of see that coherence, I think, in the policies. Anyway, Sara, you've got a comment on Deborah's line of sight, or something else Deborah was saying.
Yeah, I just wanted to kind of agree with her point about using the money to finance parts, perhaps, of infrastructure. And I think it ties back to this question of, to me, infrastructure, there's a lot of overlap with kind of clean tech. And so if you can particularly have infrastructure investments where you use the, financing the kind of standard methods to finance the standard part if you want, and then you take the part that is, whatever your kind of clean tech investment that, as a general rule, costs more upfront and then provides you savings over the lifetime of the project, and you pay for that portion, that additional portion, with the carbon revenue, which you're then obviously still getting back, actually, so it's a good investment from that sense on the infrastructure. But I think that makes a nice division and kind of maybe allows you to get over the hump of being able to pay for some of these things that may have a higher upfront cost but lower lifetime cost, and tie those to the emission reductions and the carbon money. Okay,
anybody else have a comment on anything you've just heard in the last couple of minutes? because we are now about 5 minutes from the end. So I think what I should do is I should give you each a 1 minute window to summon all of your enthusiasm and coherence and give us the 1 minute pitch. I'm pretty sure David's isn't going to take 1 minute.
No, so I think that the Eco-Fiscal Commission as such has an important job to do in demonstrating that a carbon tax is a very good way to raise revenue. And all governments, not just Alberta, need this as we all grow older, and we're going to be is a perfectly good, an exceptionally good way to raise revenue.
David, you froze, but I think what you said is that we have to do a better job at explaining that a carbon tax is a good way to raise revenue and a better way to raise revenue than many other things, and in particular in a world where we are growing older and will require an increase in healthcare spending. We're going to need the revenues, and this is a good way to do it.
Right.
Is that good? All right. Sara.
Yeah, I think we need to, come back to the original points. We need to position Alberta to be competitive in diversified and competitive in a low carbon world. We need to reduce our own emissions, and we need to protect the low and middle income and also the trade exposed industries while we're doing so. So the investment in that low carbon technology across the board, the transitional support, and the household transfers, I think, are the key choices for Alberta.
Okay, perfect. Deborah.
Well, I think I go back to how do we have government play a role? Government can use the revenues to play a role to facilitate research development, to increase productivity, decrease emissions, and to make Alberta a center of excellence for all things energy that can help diversify the economy by being able to export or having people here come to find solutions to the energy-related problems, but also to figure out how to get involve the private sector in terms of risk sharing, to make sure that what's being developed is something that has longevity. And I would also argue for the use to actually decrease corporate taxes as a way to provide additional impetus for the diversification of the economy by attracting other businesses to come here.
Perfect. Jack, you're going to get the second to last word. I get the last word. Okay,
I'm not sure I wanted to add too much more except for making 2 points. One quick one, which I said before, I think we need to understand whether we want to have differential carbon taxes or not, and that gets to the issue of what is the optimal carbon tax, why is it a good source of revenue, etc. And I frankly don't think we have an answer to those kinds of questions. It may be that you may want to tax natural gas, for example, less than coal and things like that, but I think I have not seen anyone try to estimate the appropriate levels of taxes on different types of things, and I think we need to do that kind of research, and I encourage the Eco-Fiscal Commission to do it. The other take is, I think David went about revenues and needing to take care of all the unfunded age-related expenditures in the future, and the fact that actually tax GDP ratios will be falling in Canada as more people are retired relative to workers. Because people, when they're retired, they don't spend as much, and they don't earn as much income, and so there'll actually be a falling tax GDP ratio. So certainly it's an interesting question to ask whether the carbon tax can help fill that gap. But I also would like to encourage people to be a little careful about how much other debt we keep pushing to the future, including infrastructure debt. There's not a free lunch all the time, and we've got to be very careful in terms of what kind of future liabilities we leave to later generations.
Good note to end on. Thank you very much. Well, let me just remind not just the 4 of you, but the thousands that are out there listening to this. I actually don't know what the number is, but I'm going to go with thousands. But this is the first of 5 Google Hangouts that we are having across the country. There's one in BC. There will be 4 different people having the same general conversation about how to recycle revenues in BC and in Ontario, and in Quebec, and in Atlantic Canada. So over the next, if you check out the EcoFiscal webpage at ecofiscal.ca, you can sign up for these, and I encourage you all to do that if you want to participate in those conversations. But this has been great. I want to thank you all very much, Deborah Yedlin, and David Dodge, and Sara Hastings-Simon, and Jack MIntz. Thank you very much for taking the time out of your busy schedules to talk with us. I think this has been a great conversation. I hope that there are people either with or connected to the Alberta government who have listened to all of your points of wisdom. And I look forward to seeing how these conversations are different, if they are indeed different, in those other provinces. Because one of the points of our report is that we talk about the trade-offs involved in using different approaches to recycling. But even though you use the same logic in different provinces, you may well come up with different answers in different provinces, because provinces have different economic and environmental contexts. So I look forward to seeing how this conversation evolves in the other cities and the other regions. But thank you all very much, and thank you out there in TV land. And Annette, is there anything else you would like me to say before we say goodbye? She's saying no. So thank you all very much. I hope you like this technology. I love this technology because I don't have to go anywhere. David, do you like this technology now? He almost likes it. He almost likes it, folks. Thank you very much, everybody.
Thanks.
Thank you.